1886, when the grand old man who said that his mission was to pacify Ireland set about addressing the Irish question. He addressed the church question, he addressed the land question, he talked about a sense of half-atoned injustice on the part of Britain towards Ireland. And he then, of course, very much influenced by Charles Stewart Parnell, the Protestant landlord from County Wicklow, who brought the Home Rule movement closer than anyone else to the very brink of success. Inspired by Parnell, Gladstone turned his attention to Home Rule. In fact, in 1885, he announced his conversion to Irish Home Rule and tabled the first Home Rule bill on the floor of the House of Commons before a party, his own party, the Liberal Party, a coalition party which was ill-prepared to embrace the idea of self-government for the smaller island. Many Liberals, like the great mass of British Tories, feared that Home Rule would precipitate the break-up of the British Empire, the secret of England's greatness, as the banners of the time put it. And the grand old man saw his first Home Rule bill defeated by the House of Commons, his own party split, his potential successor Joseph Chamberlain denouncing him as endangering Irish Protestants under a Catholic Parliament and endangering the future of the empire. And the scene was set really for the polarisation of politics in Ireland, in Ulster, and indeed at Westminster. Ireland became the touchstone of British politics from 1886 to 1922, and probably much later. It's not really until 1973 that the British Conservative Party dropped the kind of subtext, the Unionist Party, as they still use it in Scotland, of course. And, if you like, the Tories opposed Home Rule vigorously right down to the First World War, whereas the Liberals saw it as a challenge passed on by Mr. Gladstone down to the Edwardian years, when a new Liberal Prime Minister, not very interested in Ireland, but wanting to keep his government in power, Herbert Henry Asquith, embraced Home Rule, reluctantly perhaps, as did his senior supporters, Lloyd George, future Prime Minister, and Winston Churchill, who would reach high office also. So the scene is set really from Gladstone's day. But during the, if you like, rather sort of strenuous debates at Westminster in 1885 and 1886, no one talked about partition, the partition of Ireland. Gladstone rejected the idea as absurd. He said, half a province cannot stand in the way of the march of a nation. Of course, he was talking about Home Rule within the British Empire. Irish MPs would still sit at Westminster in smaller numbers, and Westminster would still control the commanding heights: finance, taxation, defence. So Home Rule would be Irish politicians dealing with domestic affairs like education, like health, like agriculture. That's what they were talking about. And of course, there was a small group who would grow to a much larger quantum after 1916, who were critical of the Irish Home Rule Party or the Irish Parliamentary Party, led by John Redmond after 1900, saying that it was only seeking, if you like, the shadow of independence, whereas they, in terms of Sinn Féin, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and others were seeking, if you like, full-blooded Republican independence, and we're kind of anticipating what's coming up in this period. Not very clear, I'm afraid, but just recalling the background to the re-intervention of the Home Rule question in the early years of the 20th century. It was John Redmond, of course, who reunited a Home Rule party which had been badly fractured over the Parnell split, after Parnell's great success in 1886 in convincing one of the two big British parties that Home Rule was justice for Ireland. He himself, of course, became impaled in the Kitty O'Shea divorce scandal. His private life would be, if you like, aired in public. He would be disgraced according to the standards of the Victorian age. His party would split. He would be forced to retire from the leadership of the Home Rule Party, but he wouldn't accept it. He fought back in a series of by-elections, contracted a chill, and would die prematurely at the age of 45 of pneumonia. This is Parnell. And so it took about 10 years to reconstruct the Home Rule Party, the pro-Parnellites, the anti-Parnellites. They had to find a charismatic leader who could assert his authority on those 85 or so nationalist MPs, because they were the first modern party in the British political system. Everybody copied the Home Rule Party, the Liberals, the Tories and Labour, in terms of organisation, card-carrying membership, manifestos, all of that. And it wasn't until 1900 that a former lieutenant of Parnell's emerged on the scene, John Edward Redmond. He was a man of the pale in that he was of Anglo-Norman stock, born in County Wexford, representing Waterford City in Parliament, a British imperialist, as strong a British imperialist as his opponent, Sir Edward Carson, then the MP for Dublin University, then an all-Ireland unionist. They shared so much in common: upper middle class background, the law, a sense that Ireland must play a pioneering role in the British Empire, from Canada to India to Australia. Irishmen fighting with the forces of the Crown, Irishmen acting as diplomats, like, for example, the brother of Owen MacNeill, the founder of the Gaelic League from County Antrim. His brother James MacNeill was an administrator for something like 10 million people in the Punjab under the British Raj. So Redmonds and Carson both saw Irishmen as, if you like, helping to expand and helping to consolidate the British Empire, but they differed on the question of Home Rule. Redmond believed it would enable Irishmen to have a dual loyalty, a wider British imperialist citizenship and an Irish nationality, and that Home Rule would cement what had been a very fractious relationship between Britain and Ireland down to the end of the 19th century. And by 1910, the Liberal government, in power for 4 years, found itself faced with a hung parliament. It had brought in all the great reforms: old age pensions, national insurance. It wanted to do a lot more. It was the reformist party. Historians even of the period described the Conservatives and their lack of reform as being the stupid party at the day. So really, Asquith was the Prime Minister by 1910. He wasn't very interested in Ireland, but he wanted to stay in power. And having had his majority wiped out in 2 general elections in 1910, and the standoff between the Tory House of Lords and the Liberal government on the question of reform, he turned to John Redmond and his 80 or so nationalist MPs. Redmond would back the Liberal programme at Westminster in exchange for a commitment to introduce immediately a Home Rule Bill for all Ireland, a return to the Gladstonian situation really of 1886. Then Parnell held the balance of power. Now John Redmond and his northern associate, wee Joe Devlin of Tyrone stock, the MP for West Belfast at Westminster, the architect of the kind of relaunch of the ancient order of Hibernians. Devlin realised that in the north, the burning issue wasn't land. That was the issue in the west of Ireland down to 1903 in the Land Acts. The burning issue in the north was, of course, the sectarian issue. The Orange Order was being reorganised and recalibrated by James Craig and upper middle class lawyers who had taken over Unionism, seizing it from the dead hand of the gentry. Now, of course, Devlin realised, if I'm to get the Catholic vote out in support of Home Rule, I need a machine. And that machine became the divisions or the lodges of the Hibernians. 70 lodges in County Tyrone alone, from Dungannon to Omagh to Ahayarn, in the early years of the 20th century. 120,000 members. So the Home Rule Party commanded the support of the Catholics of 9 County Ulster, a process that had been happening gradually since the extension of the franchise in the 1880s. Of course, on the Unionist side, things were happening as well. You had the democratisation of Unionism. The gentry were now forced to take a back seat. people like Colonel Saunderson, people like the Duke of Abercorn, people like the Brookes and the O'Neills. They were less important now in the unionist machine than the industrial entrepreneurial class. People like James Craig, the son of a wealthy distiller. People like Gustav Wolff, the ship owner at NP for East Belfast. And of course, unionism was a cross-class alliance, bringing together the industrial workers, the farmers and farm labourers, the big house. One focus, and that focus was to preserve the union. For unionists from the 1880s, shocked by the success of Home Rule, which jolted Protestant Ulster out of a kind of a lethargy which had seen Presbyterian and Methodist tenant farmers join with Catholic tenant farmers in voting Liberal. But that begins to fade after 1886. Henry Cooke had warned the Protestants of Ulster 50 years before that they must sort of hang together or hang separately later on. And of course, the view of Unionist Ulster was that Home Rule would be Rum Rule, and also Home Rule would be an economic disaster for the industries of the Lagan Valley, especially linen and shipbuilding. And it wasn't until 1910 that Ulster Unionism found a charismatic leader in Edward Carson, the Dublin Unionist, the son of the South, the quintessential Southern Unionist. Carson had gone into politics, having been a Crown prosecutor at the Land Courts as the MP for Trinity. And his aim was to preserve Ireland's place under the Union Jack. He reflected the fears of his mother's landed stock in County Galway, at Athenry, where he had spent his childhood holidays, where Irish was still spoken. He had a very broad-minded view, but he wanted the Union maintained. James Craig was signally uncharismatic, but he realised he'd found in Carson the Conservatives' most able, most eloquent spokesman on Ireland, on the Union. He had found the perfect leader, the perfect foil, who would, if you like, act as a kind of a magnet for Unionist support in the north of Ireland. Carson accepted. He was still hoping to use Ulster to break Home Rule and to keep Ireland within the Union Jack. But by 1912-13, as compromises were floated, first of all 4 counties, then 6, perhaps 9, no one knew where it was going to end. Carson was forced to abandon his broader vision of Irish unionism in favour of seeking the best deal for his Protestant clients in the north. And he would look back in anger. What a fool I was, he said in 1922. And so was Ulster in the game that was to get the Conservative Party into power. But he is the midwife to a new Northern Ireland state that will emerge from the turmoil and the political activism and the descent to civil war of those years, 1912 to 14. So unionism and nationalism, the Liberals support Home Rule. In the background, of course, there were the warning voices of Lloyd George from the Welsh valleys and Winston Churchill, haunted in a sense by the political ghost of his unionist father, Lord Randolph. They warned Asquith. They thought 32 county Home Rule was not doable. The Chief Secretary for Ireland, Augustine Birrell, warned Asquith that Ulster is crying and her cries are genuine. But Asquith took the view, we'll roll out all Ireland Home Rule in 1912, introduced the bill, the Parliament Act had silenced the House of Lords, and if the going gets rough by 1914, then we'll table amendments which the nationalists will be forced to accept. So the All-Ireland vision was held up to Redmond and Devlin and nationalist Ireland to begin with. But by 1914 things had been transformed. Transformed by the mobilization of Protestant Ulster. That's the thing that changes everything. It not only makes partition likely, but it makes an Irish rebellion in 1916 likely as well. Because nobody could have imagined that Carson, the grandiloquent lawyer, the law and order advocate of the 1890s as a prosecutor of the early 20th century, calling for coercion in Tory governments, nobody could have imagined that he would have called into existence a private army called the Ulster Volunteers. A private army starting in the shipyards and the orange halls of friendly landowners and spiralling into the largest non-official standing army since the United Irishmen and Volunteers of 150 years before. And of course the UVF drilling at Baronscourt, drilling on the Ranfurly lands in Dungannon, it would acquire guns famously from Germany in April 1914. It would acquire 30,000 German rifles, 3 million rounds of ammunition, and of course that would, if you like, destabilise the Irish situation. Not only that, but the Volunteers would call into existence an Irish counterpart, because in these years the Gaelic revival was underway. People were going to language classes from Cork to Antrim. Douglas Hyde and Owen MacNeill, when they launched the Gaelic League in 1893, Conrad the Gaeilge, when Irish was still spoken by about 12% of the population, they talked about de-Anglicising Ireland. They talked about reviving Irish as a spoken language. Within living memory, on the eve of the Great Famine, it had been spoken perhaps by a third of the people of County Tyrone, by perhaps 60% of the people of the island. They wanted to do what had been done in Wales, to some extent in Scotland, to revive Irish as a spoken language. And that, of course, creates the atmosphere for a new nationalism, quite apart from Home Rule, a nationalism that's concerned with language and cultural identity. Isn't just an Irish movement, it's happening all over Europe. It's happening in the Czech lands of the Austrian Empire. The Jews are reviving their language, the Poles are reviving theirs. So we have to see the Gaelic revival, this great transcendent kind of revival, as part of a European mainstream, with the emphasis on people struggling to be free in these years. And of course, that's the game changer. That enables other kind of revolutionary plans to take root in the crease in time, as some people call it, between Parnell's death in 1891 and the rising of 1916. Most important is the emergence of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or rather its re-emergence. First in Belfast, founded by young men of both traditions, the Ernest Blythes and the Sean Lesters from the Protestant tradition, and the Bulmer Hobson, who was a Quaker, Dennis McCullough, and the Dr. Patrick McCartan of Carrickmore from the kind of Catholic Republican tradition. Soon they link up with old Tom Clark, a Tyrone exile returned after 15 years in British prisons from the United States. And they form a nexus in Dublin. England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. The RIC monitor them. They're only a few hundred people, they have no support. People at meetings like this are cheering for John Redmond and Home Rule, as though that meant complete independence. So John Redmond and Joe Devlin feel they have nothing to worry about. They have the measure of Irish nationalism, and it doesn't extend to the dizzying heights of republicanism, except for a few mountainy men in the hills of Tyrone and the hills of Leitrim. And so the Home Rule Bill is introduced. It's a modest measure of independence, but it's for all Ireland. The problem is, of course, that Carson refuses to compromise. Initially, he rejected Home Rule, as did the Tories in toto. Andrew Bonar Law, the father of a Coleraine businessman who had become an iron master in Glasgow, an emotional, instinctive, even on the Ulster question, hysterical Tory, told a great Unionist meeting in England, there are things stronger than parliamentary majorities. Drink whiskey, he meant that force might be used, sanctioned by the Conservative Party and sections of the British Army in support of the Ulster cause. In these years, that consensus, which marked the British Democratic Compromise, where Parliament is an alternative to civil war, was in danger of unravelling, as insults and in some cases missiles were exchanged across the floor of the British House of Commons. And so, against this background, the Home Rule Bill is going through its stages, but the UVF is gathering, founded in January 1913. By November, there is a nationalist response. Carson has talked, I suppose, really histrionically, about leading a march of Ulster volunteers from Belfast to Cork to stop Home Rule. According to Brindley McNamara, the novelist from Delvin of the Irish Midlands, people in pubs and fair days in Westmeath and sort of surrounding counties in 1913 are saying, do you think Carson is really going to come down here with that crowd from the north? Do you think they'll be coming through here? And you have the first stirrings of a reaction to Carsonism. They're captured by the County Antrim nationalist, historian, Gaelic revivalist Owen MacNeill, born plain John MacNeill over his father's grocer's shop in Glenarm in 1867, educated at St Malachy's College. MacNeill, hearing the last echoes of Irish in Glenariff spoken as he was growing up, went to the Aran Islands and mastered the language, and co-founded with the Protestant minister's son, Douglas Hyde, co-founded the Gaelic League. Now he was the man of the moment. In November 1913, he wrote a very influential article. He called it The North Began. He praised Carson and the Ulster volunteers. He said Carson and his supporters had taken the most important step for Irish independence since Wolfe Tone. And this might have come to a shock and would have seemed insulting to many rank-and-file nationalists in the town square in Dungannon in 1913. But it warmed the hearts of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. They needed a prophet like MacNeill, and they were heartened by what was happening in what they would have called the Black North, the rise of Carson's army, drilling first with dummy rifles and then with real ones. Here was something that was defying the might of the British Parliament, something Irish Republicans always said they would do. They would stultify the will of the British Parliament to govern Ireland. And here's the UVF doing it for them in places like Ballymena and Ballinamallard. Owen MacNeill's article was picked up right away by the upper echelons of the IRB. A deputation including the Hollywood County Down Quaker, former Quaker, Bulmer Hobson, came knocking on his door. Why don't you call a meeting, they said, in a week or two, in Dublin, and form an Irish army? We'll call it the Irish Volunteers, or Óglaigh na hÉireann. It was called at a meeting in the Rotunda on the 18th of November, 1914. It became twice the size of the UVF. It covered the whole 32 counties. It began to import guns in smaller numbers. And in towns like Dungannon and Uri, there was a risk of a clash as these two citizen armies marched on summer evenings like tonight. What if a stray shot or an insult hurled produces a response and we end up with the use of lethal force? The police observing this and reporting to Dublin serious danger of civil war. That danger of civil war might have been abated if a compromise could have been reached at the Parliament at Westminster. Look at the Unionist fears. First of all, this Dantean vision of the hell that would be Belfast under Home Rule, cattle grazing round the City Hall, Robinson cleavers up for sale, statues of Redmond, Devlin, Skin the Goat, everybody else where Queen Victoria once stood. And of course, the other image of James Craig, the former Boer War captain, that stereotypical leader of the Ulster Unionist business class, throttling Mr. Asquith and treading John Redmond underfoot. That's the kind of atmosphere. In the House of Commons in 1913, Ronald MacNeill from Cushendall in County Antrim, the future Lord Cushendall, famously lifted a heavy metalled book and dropped it on the bald head of the speaking Winston Churchill, drawing blood. Things were getting rough even in Parliament amongst the two major parties as that parliamentary compromise began to evaporate in the tensions of the Irish question. Something would have to be done. Churchill and Asquith, Churchill of course a Liberal from 1903, told a reluctant John Redmond. And so In March 1914, the idea of county option was tabled in the House of Commons by Lord George. Any Ulster county could opt out of Home Rule for a period of 6 years, after which it would automatically come under a Dublin Parliament. This would ensure, of course, a united Ireland, and it would ensure in the short term that Fermanagh, Tyrone and the municipalities of Derry, Londonderry and Uri would immediately come under a Home Rule Parliament, because they had clear, though small in the case of Fermanagh and Tyrone, nationalist majorities. No one expected Carson's response. He said that the county option proposals were a sentence of death for Unionism, with a stay of execution for 6 years. He was not prepared to touch them. And from that moment, from that rejection of the compromise by Carson, the Irish situation escalated towards civil war. The next few months saw a number of important events. In March you had the Curragh Mutiny, when 57 cavalry officers in the largest British camp in Ireland, the Curragh in County Kildare. This is undivided British-ruled Ireland, of course, before 1921. They said that they would resign the service rather than accept orders to march on Ulster. The purpose, of course, would have been to disarm the UVF. The Liberal government began to realise that it didn't have the capacity to enforce Home Rule. It couldn't command its own army to enforce Home Rule. People like the ultra-loyalists from County Longford, Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, who was chief of the Imperial General Staff, were, if you like, politicking in the background. And people like Bonar Law were considering urging the king to block a Home Rule bill as repugnant to his coronation oath. So British politics, not alone Irish, are mired over this question of Home Rule and partition in these critical years. And as, of course, the Home Rule bill is overshadowed by the dark cloud of partition, volunteering becomes more popular. The county inspector of the Royal Irish Constabulary in Tyrone writes to Dublin Castle in his monthly report on secret societies, the strength of the UVF, the Hibernians of the Orange Order. He says that the nationalists feel they must have an army of their own. They dread partition. And from Auchtercloy to Newton Stewart, this movement is growing apace. And that's a snapshot of the volunteers in these years. Soon 200,000 Irish volunteers. Redmond, of course, had ignored this, hadn't taken an interest in it, regarded the use of guns as totally objectionable, but he's forced by June 1914 to get involved. Because by June 1914, there is a real danger of civil war. Not only a danger of civil war in Ireland, but the war clouds are gathering on the European front. All of those crises in Morocco and elsewhere, that naval race between Germany and Britain is hotting up. The shots at Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914, assassinating the heir apparent to the Austrian throne, galvanised the great powers. Great war is almost inevitable. The IRB, the Fenians in Dublin are rubbing their hands with glee. Things are working out beautifully. They now had secured an influential role in the Supreme Council of the Irish Volunteers. Most people were not Republicans, they were Home Rulers, but they're pulling the strings. They are the real committed leadership of the volunteers. They need that strike force for their rising. And of course, in that long summer of 1914, the other great game changer at the end of April is the Larne gun running. When the RIC are instructed to sit on their hands, tick a few names, as 30,000 German rifles, they're actually mainly Austrian guns, are distributed through the 9 counties of Ulster to the big houses of the Orange Halls across the north of Ireland, from Down to Donegal. Now the UVF has attained the military balance of power in Ireland. By that summer, there's a real danger of civil war in Ulster, as the County Tyrone writer Joseph Johnston, a Trinity College economics professor, wrote in a pamphlet he wrote that year, Civil War in Ulster. And if you read it today, He was from Castle Caulfield, so just round the corner. He outlines the movement of volunteers across the drumland country of Mid-Ulster, and he anticipates blood flowing as far south as the apocryphal Black Pig's Dyke, as civil war convulses the province. Fearful of this catastrophe, the king himself, George V, mindful of his duty of care to his Irish subjects, summoned a peace conference at Buckingham Palace in the last days of peace on the 24th of July 1914. And he wished Redmond and Carson, Asquith and Bonar-Law, representing the key parties, Godspeed in seeking a compromise solution to avert fratricidal strife in the North of Ireland. And for 3 days they manfully approached the task, producing maps of the demographic maps of the province of Ulster, painted in pink and green, depicting the strength of the two traditions, though they never used that word, the two religions across the province of Ulster, as Carson, egged on by his Ulster Unionist supporters, and Redmond, egged on by his Ulster Nationalist supporters, came almost to blows over the question of Fermanagh and Tyrone. Carson was urging Redmond to accept the exclusion of 9 counties with their 45% Catholic minority, a huge minority, 55% Protestant, 45% Catholic, most people voting according to the religious affiliations. Then Carson told his fellow lawyer and old associates in the Irish Bar Library, you should accept 9 counties, because it's the quickest way to bring about a united Ireland 10 or 20 years down the road. Redmond could see the logic of this, but he realised he wouldn't survive politically if he handed over Fermanagh and Tyrone and the city of Derry to Unionism, and so the wrangling went on. Churchill wrote afterwards, the conference became bogged down in the muddy byways of Fermanagh and Tyrone, and having driven to Enniskillen to give a similar talk on Monday night and had seen the Mullifad forest fire, I really felt I was engaging with the muddy byways myself. The world's press, or the equivalent, the Scottish, the English, the French press, had descended on Belfast and Dungannon in those last days of July, early August 1914, to watch the outbreak of civil war. They'd seen civil wars in Europe, but here was one within the United Kingdom. And then suddenly, on the 3rd of August 1914, the Germans declared their intention to invade neutral Belgium, and within 24 hours, Britain was at war. A divided Britain, a divided government. Many of the Liberals rejected war and compulsory service, but they were dragged in, bringing with them those two rival armies, as Redmond and Carson committed themselves. And of course the Irish question is thrown into touch by all of this. It becomes, if you like, suspended in animation for the duration of the Great War, as Irishmen of both religious traditions, of both political traditions, join either the 16th Irish, if they're Redmondites, to fight for Ireland and the freedom of small nations, or they join the 36th Ulster Division, if they're Carsonites, to fight for Ulster and the Empire. Same uniform, same flag, different aspirations as they go into the killing fields of Europe in 1915 and 1916. It's against that background. You have an Ireland, on the surface, totally north-south supporting the British war effort. And yet, beneath the surface, the IRB are active. Redmond's support for the war effort had split the volunteers. And of course, almost immediately, a minority broke away. They gravitated towards the IRB, still led by Eoin MacNeill, and they're very much the striking force for the rising that Tom Clarke, Sean McDermott, Patrick Pearse and the rest are planning in the early months of the war. Clarke had been in America, and he used a phrase that he probably never picked up in Dungannon in the 1860s or 70s, the psychological moment. And Tom Clarke always said, we must strike at the psychological moment, because that moment will pass. And to Clarke, 1915-1916 was the optimal moment to create a rebellion in Dublin, a diversion, which might be supported by Britain's enemy, Germany, and might, if not successful, might be a propaganda success. They might triumph from their martyrs' graves, which is really what happens with the executions that follow the surrender of Pearse on the 30th of April 1916. Sean McDermott had summed it up: we'll hold Dublin for a week and save Ireland. They were successful. The Home Rule Party had been caught off guard. Public opinion is changing. Even in Tyrone, the police report sympathy from the rank and file nationalists in the fields and in the streets of the towns for the bravery of the men of 1916. For Unionists it's different though. This was a stab in the back of Britain and the brave Irishmen fighting at the Western Front. That's the overwhelming Unionist view, although Carson is very restrained in his language. He says he's not calling for revenge. He's aware of the emotional nature of Irish nationalism. John Redmond, and particularly his deputy John Dillon, are aware that if they don't handle this well, the executions will play badly for the moderate nationalists, and they may give way to a movement that people are describing as Sinn Féin. It was never the Sinn Féin rebellion. It was an IRB rebellion, but the government are dubbing it the Sinn Féin rebellion. And suddenly supporters of the rising are identified with an almost non-existent party called Sinn Féin. And it's in these circumstances that the Home Rule leaders allowed themselves to be, if you like, drawn into a scheme which was constructed by Lord George, Asquith's deputy, for a compromise in the wake of the Rising in June 1916. A compromise which will give most of Ireland Home Rule during the war, diffuse the issue. The issue was a live one in America. Irish Americans, a major support base of the Democratic Party. Britain needed America in this war. There was no movement on the Western Front. Ireland would have to be addressed publicly to please Irish America and bring President Wilson into the war. And so the focus was on 6 counties. Basically, 6 counties were to be excluded from the Dublin Parliament. Redmond and the Nationalists were led to believe it would be temporary, would be reviewed after the war. Irish MPs would still sit in Westminster, 100 strong, giving the Northern Nationalists who were separated from the rest of the Irish people a guarantee of fair play and future Irish unity. But Carson was one ahead. He had been given a written assurance by Lord George that the partition wrought in 1916 would be permanent and enduring, no matter what Redmond thought. This was a permanent line on the map, but there would be no Stormont Parliament. It would be direct rule. In many ways it would be a very soft border. It would be like going from, council borders have been redrawn, but from Mid-Ulster Council to Armagh, Craigavon Council, the rates might be a bit different. And there might be a slightly different policy on the Irish language in schools. But there would be no real border. It would be like going from Carlisle to Scotland. It would be an excluded area. For nationalists, it would keep open the door on future possibilities of Irish unity. Redmond hoped after the war, when orange and green blood, if you like, commingled on the battlefields, a new sense of Irish united identity might emerge in this great idealistic campaign. It came to 2 conferences, one in the Ulster Hall where Carson sadly tore up the Covenant and told the loyalists of Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal that because of the greater interests implied in the war, they would have to fall on their swords and become part of an Irish Parliament. They accepted it, but reluctantly. And even as late as 1920, the Monaghan, Cavan and Donegal Unionists would plead with Carson and Gray to include them in the Ulster Pale. After all, they were 80,000 strong, and they had also signed the Covenant. The Nationalists ended up at a conference in St Mary's Hall, Belfast, on a day forever known as Black Friday, the 23rd of June, 1916. If you think it was Brexit Day last year, you're right. Depending on your views, that water was not another Black Friday. And the result was that Redmond, Dillon and Devlin put it to the 800 Northern Nationalists assembled from Fermanagh to Rowan, South Down, the rest, that this was the best deal they could get, that this was only a temporary arrangement, that they would still have a lot of Irish MPs at Westminster to protect their interests. And when there was opposition from the nationalists west of the Bann, the Murnahans and the Shields and the Shields in Omagh, and a man called Frank J. O'Connor, who was an eminent solicitor. He was the main orator for the Redmondite critics of the conference, warning them that this agreement would result in permanent partition and the abandonment of Ulster Catholics who had fought for generations for a united Ireland. When it went to a vote, after Redmond threatened to resign, it was carried by a 200-strong majority. But Northern nationalism was fractured on an east-west basis from that day. West of the Bann, Sinn Féin, which was emerging in the south, began to spread, using the anti-Redmondite critics in Dungannon, Omagh and Derry as their main support base. The main problem was, of course, the southern Unionists. Those people, that 10% south of Ulster, mainly members of the landed gentry and the Church of Ireland, they were more opposed to partition in the final analysis than they were to Home Rule, because partition meant that if you were a Cork or a Clare Protestant, well, you had no hope of a future. You were cut off from the Protestant majority in North East Ulster if Ireland was partitioned, and subject to a parliament dominated by people alien to your religion and politics. So led by Lord Lansdowne, a powerful figure in the Tory party and an Irish landlord, and Sir Walter Long, a former Irish MP, they led a revolt on the Tory backbenches. They said that the Lloyd George partition scheme was a surrender to force. It would lead to a republic. And soon the Tories wrecked the scheme. It collapsed. Redmond felt betrayed, having gone so far, having alienated so many Northern nationalists, having alienated many bishops whom he had tried to keep on side, including the astute Cardinal Logue of Armagh. There seemed to be no way back for the Nationalist Party. And of course, as Ireland continued to reverberate from the wave of sympathy unleashed by the Rising, the 1916 partition scheme was another nail, a very serious one, in the coffin of the Home Rulers. After that, Sinn Féin won by-election after by-election, from Roscommon to Longford to East Clare in 1917, when Éamon de Valera replaced the much-loved Major William Redmond, killed at the Battle of Messines on the Western Front. His death, fighting for a cause that most Irish nationalists had now abandoned, his replacement by the living symbol of the Rising, was a sign of the sea change that was overtaking this island, the terrible beauty that was being born, as he put it, in this period. The impact of those executions, the blood flowing from a closed door, as the aristocratic Lady Fingal had put it. No sympathy with the rebels, yet day after day she'd seen the executions studded in the press. P.H. Pearce was shot this morning. J. Connolly was shot. No mention of the chair or the stonebreaker's yard. But this leaked out. It was transforming attitudes, especially in the younger generation. Beyond that lay, of course, the 1918 election, the Sinn Féin landslide. Only 6 survivors of the once great Redmondite party, Redmond himself, now in his grave. Joe Devlin, the last notable survivor, believing he'd lost his mandate to the New Republicans, who proceeded, of course, to reaffirm the Republic of 1916, who proceeded to establish the first Dáil, and on the first day the Dáil met in January 1919. At Solohead Beg in County Tipperary, a little rural crossroads, the first two RIC fatalities of the War of Independence were killed by volunteers acting on their own initiatives. They would be the first of 450 RIC men killed in that war, as the RIC, 80% Catholic, exposed, living in the community, drawn from the community, most of them moderate home rulers, found itself the pathetic casualty of this escalating conflict as the Dáil is suppressed and Lloyd George refused to acknowledge the declared republic. Of course, the sea change that had come about at Westminster was vital to understanding partition. In 1914, you had a Liberal government dependent on 80 Irish moderate nationalists. By 1990, you had a coalition government, mainly Tory, led by a Liberal Lloyd George, no longer dependent on Irish nationalists. Sinn Féin didn't take its 73 seats, but including 26 Unionists, most of them from the north, led by Carson and Craig. They had one demand. If we wouldn't accept home rule, we will never accept a republic or a free state within the empire. We want the total permanent exclusion of northeast Ulster. And they had a choice. Lloyd George was then see where I am here. The 1916 Rising, of course. It was make your mind up time for Lloyd George. He had spent a year and a half at Versailles in the Great Hall of Mirrors with the victorious powers, America, and their allies, France and Italy, all demanding a slice of the European cake. There were three empires to be disposed of, as Germany, Austria-Hungary, and most of Russia lay in ruins. And Lloyd George redrew that map, allowing for plebiscites here and there as territory was awarded to Poland or Germany or Denmark, plebiscites by the male voting population. Well, perhaps there was a template there for Ireland, a bit like County Option 1914. It wasn't until the fall of 1919, October 1919, that a committee was set up at Westminster. This was a coalition government, but the Tories were in the ascendant. And this drew on Liberals and Conservatives. It was chaired by Walter Long, a former Dublin Unionist MP, an Anglo-Irish squire, who had a duty of care to the southern Protestants, as well as a concern that Ulster should be free from Dublin rule. And they sat down and they had two big issues to decide. One was, what would the acreage be of the excluded area? Would it be 9 counties with that small Unionist majority of 55%? And secondly, would it be 6 counties? The area that Carson had demanded, he called it the clean cut. That demand for Fermanagh and Tyrone, which flew in the face of democracy, Versailles style, but was meant to bring in the big houses of Ulster, who had led the key role in the Unionist campaign. You know, the Crichtons of Crum, the Belmores of Florence, of Enniskillen, the Abercorns of Ballinscourt. They wanted to be part of the Ulster Pale as well, and regretted abandoning the Rossmores and the Shirleys and the Saundersons to the south. Or would it be a 4-county Ulster? Maybe 3.5 to 4, bringing in the Ulster heartland. This was the question. Secondly, how would Ireland be governed? Would there be a Dublin Parliament for the south, or would there be 2 parliaments? This was the age of self-determination. Britain wanted to escape from the Irish bog. For 50 years, they had been blocked at every turn by nationalists in the House of Commons, keeping them up all night like Joe Bigger, filibustering their proceedings, wrecking their business. Here was a chance to get rid of the whole shebang, devolve Irish matters back to Ireland. If the Irish couldn't agree on one parliament, give them 2, but get rid of them. That was a general consensus. And so the Long Committee decided, by December 1920, as this cartoon captures, to exclude the whole province of Ulster from a Dublin Parliament, but to give it a Belfast Parliament. So a Belfast Parliament would govern the province from Belfast to Cavan and from Down to Donegal. This, the Liberals in that committee hoped, would lead to a greater search for compromise between the slight Unionist majority and the slight nationalist minority. And Britain could retreat to Westminster as Dublin ruled the south. And that would have been the Northern Ireland of 1920, except that James Craig, who was a junior minister, whose 20-odd unionists were supporting the government, got to hear of it. He was astute, he was sure-footed in the corridors of power. He was about to replace the aging Carson as the future Prime Minister of this new statelet of Northern Ireland. And he made it known to the committee that he didn't want 9 counties. After the Covenant, after all that, he only wanted 6, but no less than 6. 6 counties, he told the Long Committee in December 1919, would see an area that was eminently more governable and where Protestant representation would be strengthened. He's quite blunt about it. It was about getting the maximum of Catholics out of this new state and the maximum of Protestants in, consonant with its permanent survival within the UK. Lloyd George, the Welsh wizard, could not deny Craig's demand. He would need Craig to run his new Irish state after 1921. And so as this act went through its stages, the Unionists were consulted, they shaped the bill, they were forced to accept very reluctantly a Council of Ireland with limited powers, railways, agricultural diseases, representative of the 2 Irish parliaments. Craig didn't want proportional representation, which was being introduced to give minorities north and south protection. And so he was allowed to repeal it after 3 years. It would finally go for Stormont elections in 1929. Craig had shaped the bill in the likeness of the Ulster Unionist Council. Indeed, he saw this new parliament for 6 counties as the reincarnation of the Ulster Provisional Government of 1912, which he had chaired, and which had anticipated the permanent partition of Ireland. Sinn Féin, meanwhile, was more focused on winning the Anglo-Irish War and achieving international recognition for the Republic. You had De Valera's over-lengthy visit to the United States, 18 months spent there, 1919 to 1920. Michael Collins in charge of the escalating war in Ireland. Arthur Griffith, the pacifist, trying to extend his Republican courts. The Dáil refusing to recognise the impending partition. Deputations from Fermanagh, Tyrone, South Down on a regular basis. Lloyd George now realised he had partition in the making. This was his chance to set up a northern state in the absence of Sinn Féin criticism, because they were absent. Churchill said as he walked into the House of Commons on the first day in 1919, he'd had a nightmare. He always overdrank brandy late at night and smoked too many cigars, which is probably why he lived to be 92. But anyway, he said that he had a very sleepless night, and he began to have a nightmare. And he saw Michael Collins and De Valera taking their seats at Westminster just for badness. And he got up, you get up half believing the nightmare. And he actually put on his coat and went down and looked into the strangers' gallery of the House of Commons. And he wrote with relief, "I rejoiced in the blessed abstention of Sinn Féin," because they had stayed in Dublin. The largest Irish party were the Ulster Unionists, flying the Union Jack in defiance in the north of Ireland. And having achieved that, and having achieved his goal in elections in May 1921 for the new Northern Ireland Parliament, and having had that Parliament set up in state in June, Lloyd George turned his attention to the south, because for the first time he had succeeded in separating out the southern question from the northern question. Now Collins and De Valera would have to accept as a fait accompli the pre-existence of the constitutional security of this new state called Northern Ireland. From that moment, Churchill wrote in May 1921, from that moment Ulster's position was unassailable. No matter how Collins, De Valera, Griffith attacked the Ulster Rock during the treaty negotiations, they would be repeatedly told by Lloyd George that they would have to consult Craig, who was a democratically elected Prime Minister at the head of a democratically elected government. They kept coming back to the pre-existence of Northern Ireland. And it was only when that constitutional entity, this one, was set up that Lloyd George went into overdrive to bring about a truce with the IRA. using the King's speech at Belfast City Hall as a grandiloquent gesture, as the King called on Irishmen to stretch out the hand of forgiveness and reconciliation, and to seek for the land that they loved, a new era of peace, contentment and goodwill. This wasn't a message for Craig and his exclusively unionist audience as the nationalists sullenly boycotted the day. This was a message for De Valera, 100 miles away in Dublin. This was an overture for peace talks. Dev accepted it, and after various difficulties and a truce, we had the treaty negotiations. But in those negotiations, from October to December 1921, it proved impossible for the Irish delegates, Collins, Griffith and their associates, to force Lloyd George to bring the Ulster Pale within a united Ireland. For a moment in November 1921, it looked as though they had succeeded. Lloyd George needed to get Sinn Féin to accept Crown and Empire, something less than the Republic, a free state like Canada. But they said they wouldn't unless they got a united Ireland. They talked about a boundary commission. So he summoned Craig to London and gave him a dressing down of Shakespearean rhetoric. Told him the game was up, Ulster would have to make sacrifices. If he succeeded that day, and he seems to have, within a week Craig and his cabinet were back, refusing Lloyd George's treachery and calling on their Conservative allies to back them. And in the end, at the treaty negotiations, in the wee small hours of the 6th of December 1921, as an exhausted Collins and Griffith faced Lloyd George and the seasoned ministerial team of the British cabinet, they were forced to accept terms which were as hardline on Crown and Empire and unrelenting in Ulster. Yes, they achieved one thing, the idea of a boundary commission to redraw that border between North and South. Collins was thinking of the Silesian Boundary Commission, which split the province of Silesia between Germany and Poland. The area moved by 51%. 51%, a bit like Brexit, voted in favour of Poland, then that territory went to Poland. Collins was certain that he could deliver Fermanagh, Tyrone, South Armagh, South Down from Newcastle, and the city of Derry struck Londonderry, and that this would hang like a sword of Damocles over Unionism, giving Craig food for thought. Could this northeastern remnant of Ireland survive without the rest? Well, the economic answer was yes, of course, because shipbuilding and engineering and the rest didn't need the South, they needed the British Empire. There was a trade with the South, but it was minor compared to the commanding heights. But Collins allowed himself to be persuaded by Lloyd George that the Boundary Commission would deliver more than half the territory of Northern Ireland. But he failed to insist on something that was vital if he was to realise even half of that. There was no provision for a plebiscite, as there was in European boundary commissions under the Versailles Treaty. I remember years ago doing a talk like this, much less assured, before an audience when I was just out of my prime. And a German woman in the audience said, "But he must have known. I mean, Collins must have known. All over the papers it said plebiscites in Poland, plebiscites in Denmark. What was he thinking of? Didn't ask for a plebiscite." He didn't. From top to bottom. The treaty paved the way to civil war. Collins tried to renegotiate deals with Craig, the Craig-Collins pacts and all of that in 1922. The Northern Nationalists were led to believe that they were pushing an open door, Collins said, in demanding Irish unity. The Boundary Commission would save them. Privately, though, Lloyd George was telling his mainly Conservative ministers that he had got Irish nationalists to accept something Redmond had never accepted, the partition of Ireland, without any guarantees. There was one legal fiction created, though. Lloyd George had placed the whole of Ireland in the Irish Free State. The North in the end had a year to opt out. So for a year, December 21 to December 22, we were all Free Staters. Even Dungannon was legally in the Irish Free State. But the Irish Parliament had no right to interfere here until Ulster made its decision. That decision was made on the 7th of December, 1922, the day after the treaty was ratified at Westminster, and the North opted out of the Free State. But that's why some of you may have wondered for many, many years, down to the Good Friday Agreement, people in Northern Ireland were able to get Irish passports if they had an ancestor born in Ireland before, and this was key, the 7th of December 1922, because all of Ireland was in the Free State. That legal fiction may have encouraged Collins to believe everything was possible. But by the summer of 1922, as the Civil War spread, he would become its paramount victim, the man who had given assurances, military and political, to the one-third minority, now finding themselves effectively cut off from that blood supply which Collins had provided before the Civil War. It would be a few more years before the Boundary Commission was finally established. The South had to settle the Civil War. Britain was in political confusion in these years. 4 prime ministers in 4 years, including a brief Labour government, minority government, in 1924. It wasn't until 1923 that the Free State appointed Eoin MacNeill as its representative. He met the criteria laid down by William Cosgrave, Collins' successor, that the Irish representative of the Boundary Commission had to be a minister, a northerner, and a Catholic. He seemed to think a Catholic would have more of a resonance with the Catholics of the North. That excluded Ernest Blythe from Lisburn, an eminent Protestant in the Free State cabinet. The British eventually responded. Craig refused to appoint a commissioner for the North, so the British appointed one for him, J.R. Fisher, a friend of Craig's, a former editor of the Northern Week, a man who had urged Craig to seek Donegal in any final deal. He said, if we get Donegal, he told Craig in 22, we will get some of the best Ulster Unionists in the Lagan, and we'll place a hostile Afghanistan in safekeeping. Amazing that language, isn't it? 1922. And then there was the chairman. Everyone agreed the chairman would have to be neutral. The chairman was an Englishman who was a South African judge, Richard Feetham, nationalist who would later use the phrase Feetham Cheetham about the chairman of the commission. The commission was incorporated in 1924. It made a tour of the border, passing through the Clogher Valley, climbing the Grainon of Ilock outside Derry, where Eoin MacNeill, the archaeologist, showed them the lochs below, Loch Swilly and Loch Foyle. They heard the evidence of corporations and councils, unionist and nationalist deputations, Presbyterian churches, Roman Catholic priests, as they moved from Rostrevor to Enniskillen to Omagh to the main city. By the time they got to Enniskillen, the Irish government observers were convinced that the chairman had decided on mere rectification, just trimming the line here and there. He had told the nationalists in Derry that to place Derry in the Irish Free State might be to create a serious surgical operation. Now, the nationalist case had always been that Derry / Londonderry belonged to Donegal. The railway system was centred in Derry. The railways left Derry for Donegal. The flax came from Donegal into Derry. The milk from the Lagan provided a large part of northwest Ulster's milk supply. The great anchor liners going to the United States sat off Mobile, and the tender brought people down from the port of Derry. The two were inextricably linked. This must have had some impact on the Commission. It wasn't until November 1925 that a leak appeared in a British newspaper with a rough map of the border. To the horror of the Irish government and Northern nationalists, who had been very active in organising the nationalist case for the border counties, to their horror, this map suggested that a large part of East Donegal, really from Derry to very close to Letterkenny, bringing in Newton, Cunningham and the Lagan, would be incorporated in Northern Ireland, bringing in all those big Presbyterian farmers settled in the plantation period. That an important part of South Armagh, centred on Crossmaglen, would go south. But apart from that, just a few minor changes in places like Pettico, the Tyrone salient at Ahayarn overlooking Lough Derg would go south, but not very productive land. The Free State objected. MacNeill resigned, made a rambling speech, but going along with the premise of the chairman to avoid civil war. Finally, negotiations at Chequers between the three governments. The Boundary Commission of the Boundary Agreement of 1925 set aside the report of the Boundary Commission. Thank you very much.